My name is Daniel Harper. I have been employed as a park ranger with the State Parks Department for just over 11 years, assigned primarily to patrol, visitor safety, and search coordination within a protected forest zone that does not receive heavy tourism traffic. I am writing this as a formal personal record, not as an official statement, because the incidents I am about to describe do not exist in any report, logbook, or internal database I have access to. They should, but they do not. What happened took place over the course of a single day, beginning before sunrise and ending well after nightfall, and it permanently altered how I understand my job, my surroundings, and the meaning of the word missing. The morning started normally enough. I woke at 5:12 a.m. in my ranger cabin, the same way I had for years, to the low hum of the heater and the wind brushing through the pines outside. The weather report predicted clear skies and mild temperatures, and there were no alerts issued for wildlife activity or trail hazards. I remember feeling oddly rested, which in hindsight feels important. The radio check-in at 5:30 went as expected. 2 other rangers confirmed their positions. No overnight incidents were reported. No lost hikers. No emergency calls. Everything appeared clean and routine, which matched what our internal system displayed on my terminal. At 6:04 a.m., I noticed the first inconsistency. While reviewing trail camera maintenance schedules, I saw a handwritten note clipped to my clipboard that I did not remember placing there. It read, in plain block letters, "Check mile marker 17 again." That marker sat along a decommissioned service road, near the edge of the park, an area rarely visited and not included in standard patrol rotations. I assumed I had written it myself and simply forgotten. Something that happens more often than people admit in this line of work. Still, the wording bothered me. The word, again, suggested prior action, yet there was no record of any recent inspection there. By mid-morning, I drove out toward mile marker 17. The road was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get deep inside protected land where engines, voices, and distant towns can't reach. The forest felt unchanged, grounded, familiar. No strange sounds, no unusual wildlife behavior. Nothing that would suggest danger or disturbance. When I reached the marker, I found no signs of recent activity. No tire tracks, no footprints, no debris. I logged the inspection as clear and prepared to leave when my radio crackled with a brief burst of static. I waited for a call that never came. Returning to the ranger station just before noon, I checked the incident board again. That's when I noticed a small discrepancy that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. Our missing persons board, which we use for active and historical cases, had an empty magnet space where a file card should have been. The alphabetical sequence was off by 1. There was no card on the floor, no note explaining its removal, and no digital entry indicating a case had been closed or transferred. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to convince myself it was a simple administrative oversight. But something about that empty space felt deliberate. I accessed the internal system and ran a manual search for any cases removed or archived in the past 72 hours. The result came back clean. No deletions, no updates, no changes. Yet I knew with a certainty that made my chest tighten that something was missing. Not just a file, but an entire record. A person. Around 1:40 p.m., a hiker came into the station asking for water and directions. He mentioned casually that he had seen someone sitting off trail near a creek, just staring at the water. According to him, The person didn't respond when spoken to and didn't look injured, just lost in thought. I asked for a description. The hiker hesitated, then said he couldn't really remember. Not the face, not the clothes, just the posture. I logged the interaction anyway, though it didn't meet criteria for a reportable incident. By mid-afternoon, the sense of unease had settled into something heavier. I checked radio logs from earlier in the week and found several short transmissions marked as signal error, with no sender ID. The timestamps aligned with patrol shifts that had only included one ranger each. I was one of them. I had no memory of making those calls. The audio files attached were empty, registering as 0 seconds long, as if something had been recorded and then stripped away. At 4:18 p.m., I received a call from dispatch asking me to confirm the status of a missing persons case. I had apparently flagged as urgent earlier that day. When I asked for the case number, there was a pause on the line. Dispatch said they didn't have one. Only a note stating that Ranger Harper had requested immediate follow-up regarding unlisted disappearances. Those exact words. I told them I had made no such request. They apologized and blamed a system glitch. As daylight began to fade, I returned once more to mile marker 17, driven by an instinct I couldn't justify. This time, I noticed something I had missed earlier. A narrow path pressed into the undergrowth, subtle enough to blend into the forest floor, unless you knew where to look. It led away from the road and into denser trees. I followed it for less than 100 yards before the radio on my belt emitted a sharp burst of static, followed by a voice that sounded like my own saying my name. It cut off immediately. I stood there, alone, surrounded by perfectly ordinary trees, listening to the silence that followed. No Muko. No explanation. When I checked the radio log later, there would be no record of that transmission. Just like the others. By the time I returned to the station, night had fully settled in. I sat at my desk, reviewing everything again, trying to assemble a logical sequence of events that fit within established procedures and natural explanations. I failed. There were too many gaps. Too many absences where information should have been. I realized then that whatever was happening wasn't creating incidents. It was erasing them. I am documenting this now because I am afraid that if I don't, I might become another empty space on a board that no one remembers to question. This is only the beginning of what happened that day. There is more I haven't explained yet. And by the time the sun rose again, I would understand that these disappearances were not accidents, not crimes, and not recorded anywhere they were supposed to be. I did not sleep that night, though technically it was still the same day. Time felt stretched and thin, like it was being pulled in opposite directions. After documenting everything I could remember in my personal notebook, I sat at the ranger station desk, watching the clock crawl forward minute by minute. Nothing new appeared in the official system. No alerts. No acknowledgments. It was as if the park itself had decided that the day was already over and no longer worth recording. At 8:47 p.m., the radio crackled again. This time it was a routine check, in request from Ranger Lewis, one of the 2 rangers assigned to the southern perimeter. His voice sounded normal, calm, unaware of anything out of place. I responded, confirmed my location, and asked if he'd experienced any signal interference earlier. There was a brief pause before he answered. He said no, then asked me why I sounded off. I told him I was just tired. That was the truth, or at least part of it. Minutes later, I checked the live ranger location map. Lewis's tracker was stationary, blinking at the edge of a marked trail that had been closed for over a year due to erosion. That alone wasn't alarming. Rangers sometimes stop to investigate fallen trees or wildlife movement. What bothered me was the timestamp. According to the system, his tracker had been stationary at that exact location since 2:11 p.m., 6 hours earlier. I pulled up the radio log. His check-in from moments ago didn't exist. I tried calling him directly. The radio emitted only static. Against protocol, I left the station alone and drove toward his last known position. The road cut through thick forest, headlights carving narrow tunnels through darkness. The farther I drove, the quieter it became. Even the usual night sounds, crickets, distant movement, wind through branches, felt muted, like they were being absorbed before they could reach me. When I reached the trailhead, Lewis's patrol vehicle was there, engine cold, keys still in the ignition. The driver's door was open. I called his name once. Then again, louder. My voice felt wrong in the air, too sharp, too present. I followed the trail with my flashlight, scanning the ground for tracks. There were footprints, clear and fresh, leading off the path and into the trees. They stopped abruptly at a small clearing, the soil undisturbed beyond that point. No signs of struggle, no marks indicating a fall, just absence. My radio came alive without warning. I heard breathing. Slow, controlled, unmistakably human. I demanded identification. The breathing stopped. Then a voice spoke, low and familiar, asking me if I could see it too. I asked what he meant. There was no reply. The transmission ended. When I checked the radio's display, it showed my own unit ID as the sender. I returned to the station just after midnight, shaken but still functioning. I followed procedure as best I could, filing a missing ranger report and escalating it to dispatch. The system accepted my entry, assigned it a temporary reference number, and then right in front of me, removed it. The screen refreshed. The report was gone. No error message. No warning. Just gone. I sat back and stared at the monitor, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. For the first time, a thought formed that I had been avoiding all day. The park wasn't malfunctioning. It was filtering, deciding what counted as real enough to keep. At 1:36 a.m., motion sensors near the old fire lookout tower triggered an alert. That tower had been unmanned for years, deemed structurally unsound, and removed from active use. I checked the camera feed. The image showed the base of the tower, illuminated by moonlight. Nothing appeared out of place. Then, at the edge of the frame, a human silhouette passed briefly through view. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if aware of being observed. I enhanced the footage. The figure wore a ranger uniform. I drove there immediately. The tower loomed above the trees, dark and skeletal. The air felt colder, heavier. As I approached, I noticed something carved into the wooden support beams near the ladder. Names. Dozens of them. Some were faint and weathered. Others looked recent. I recognized more than a few. Rangers, hikers, visitors. People who, according to official records, had never gone missing. At the base of the ladder sat a radio identical to mine. It was powered on. The display showed a single message: still on duty. I didn't climb the tower. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away, my mind racing, trying to hold on to rational explanations that were slipping faster by the hour. When I returned to the station for the final time that night, the missing persons board had changed again. The empty space was gone. In its place was a new card. My name was written on it. I removed it immediately. The moment I did, every light in the station flickered, and the radio emitted a long, steady tone. When the lights stabilized, the board was blank. Completely blank. No names, no cases. As if no one had ever disappeared here at all. I am still here, as I write this, finishing what I started earlier in the day. I don't know how long that will remain true. What I do know is that the park does not forget by accident. It erases with intent. And I am beginning to understand that these disappearances are not failures of record keeping. They are part of a system designed to keep the forest quiet, orderly, and free of unresolved questions. By the time the long tone from the radio finally died, the station felt emptied out. Like a building after an evacuation drill that never officially happened. I sat in the dark for several minutes without moving, waiting for something else to fail. Nothing did. The lights held steady. The heater clicked on and off. The computer fans hummed. Normal systems behavior. That normalcy was worse than any alarm. It suggested that whatever had just occurred was acceptable to the park. I checked the time. It was 2:03 a.m. still the same day. Still my shift. I tried to call dispatch again, not to report anything new, but to establish contact. Proof that someone outside this boundary still acknowledged me. The call rang, connected, and then dropped. On the second attempt, the line stayed open but no one spoke. I could hear faint room noise on the other end, paper moving, a chair scraping. I said my name and badge number. The noises stopped. The line went dead. When I checked the call log, there was no record of either attempt. I decided to document everything on paper, not because it was better, but because it felt older, harder to erase. I wrote until my hand cramped, filling pages with timestamps, descriptions, names I remembered from the carvings at the tower. When I reached the bottom of the last page in the notebook, I realized something else had changed. The ink on the earliest entries looked faded, lighter than it should have been after only a few hours. I pressed harder on the pen, retraced a sentence. The words darkened, then slowly lightened again, as if the paper were absorbing and rejecting them at the same time. At 2:41 a.m., the exterior motion light turned on. I stood and moved to the window. The light cast a hard white circle onto the gravel lot. No one was there. Then the beam shifted, not flickered, but rotated slightly, as if tracking movement, just outside its range. I stepped outside with my flashlight, keeping the door open behind me. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs. The forest beyond the lot stood perfectly still. I followed the edge of the light until I saw footprints leading away from the station. Ranger boots. Fresh. They went straight into the trees without hesitation. I knew then that following them was not a choice. I was making so much as one the park expected. Still, I left the door open. I wanted something behind me to remain where I had left it. The footprints led me toward the old service trail that connected, eventually, to the fire lookout tower. Along the way I noticed other signs: discarded gloves, a cracked flashlight lens, a folded map weighted down by a stone. Items left neatly, deliberately. Not lost, not dropped, staged. Each object felt like a marker, not for navigation, but for memory. Halfway there, my radio came alive again. This time, it carried multiple voices layered over one another, all speaking calmly, professionally, using the language of routine check-ins and status updates. I recognized some of the voices. Others I didn't. None of the transmissions overlapped logically. Times didn't match. Locations contradicted each other. It sounded like a college of days, and compressed into a single channel. Then one voice cut through clearly, close and unmistakable. It was Ranger Lewis. He said my name and told me I was late. I responded without thinking, asking where he was. He gave coordinates that pointed directly to where I was standing. When I looked up from the GPS, the forest ahead of me had changed. The path widened slightly, just enough to suggest regular use. The trees seemed younger here, closer together, their bark unscarred by age. The air felt wrong, flatter, like altitude sickness without the elevation. The tower came into view through the branches, its silhouette sharper than before. The ladder that I had refused to climb earlier now stood clear of debris, clean, almost maintained. At the base, more names had been added to the wood. I scanned them quickly and felt my stomach drop when I recognized a name that should not have been there yet. Mine. The radio on the ground was gone. I climbed the ladder. Each rung creaked in a way that felt rehearsed, not weakened. Halfway up, my radio slipped from my belt and caught on a rung, swinging gently. The display lit up on its own. A single line of text appeared. Logging active personnel. I freed the radio and continued upward. At the top, the platform was empty except for a desk and a logbook. The desk was identical to the one at the station, down to the coffee stain on the corner. The logbook lay open. The handwriting inside was neat, consistent, and painfully familiar. Page after page documented patrols, weather observations, minor incidents. Normal entries, my entries. Except the dates extended backward and forward beyond anything I could remember. Years I hadn't worked here. Years that hadn't happened yet. The final entry was incomplete. It ended mid-sentence, describing a ranger leaving the tower to investigate a light near the station. I closed the book. Behind me, I heard movement. Not footsteps. A shift in space, like someone occupying a place that had been empty a moment before. I turned slowly. A figure stood at the far edge of the platform, facing out toward the forest. The uniform was correct. The posture was correct. The face, when it turned toward me, was mine, but exhausted in a way I couldn't yet feel. It spoke without moving its mouth, telling me that staying meant continuity, that leaving meant gaps, that the park required someone to remain on duty so the rest could be removed cleanly. No incidents, no reports, no unresolved absences. I backed away until my heel hit the ladder opening. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. I understood then that this was not a threat, not an entity, not something to fight. It was a role, a vacancy that needed filling. I descended as fast as I could without falling and ran back toward the station. The door I had left open was closed when I arrived. Inside, everything was as I had left it, except the board. The missing persons board was no longer blank. It held a single card. Ranger on duty. Status. Active. The time read 5:11 a.m. The radio crackled with the morning check-in request. I answered automatically. My voice sounded steady. Professional. When I looked out the window, the forest was waking up, birds calling, light filtering through the trees. Another day beginning. The system intact. I am finishing this record now, because I don't know how many more mornings I will remember writing it. If you find this, if this exists somewhere outside the park, understand that the disappearances aren't happening because no one is watching. They're happening because someone always is. The morning proceeded with the practiced efficiency of routine, and that frightened me more than anything that had come before. At 5:30 a.m., I completed the radio check in exactly as I had hundreds of times before. My voice carried no tremor. The other ranger on duty responded, with the expected confirmation, unaware of anything out of place. I wrote down the exchange in the official log, and this time the ink stayed dark. No fading, no resistance. The page accepted the words as if they belonged there. Outside, the forest looked harmless again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, catching on dew-soaked leaves and turning them briefly gold. Birds moved between branches. Somewhere in the distance, a vehicle passed along the access road. All the familiar cues of a normal day returned, and with them came a dangerous temptation to believe that the night had been an anomaly. Fatigue, stress, an overactive imagination brought on by isolation. That belief lasted until I checked the station inventory. 2 radios were listed as active under my unit ID. I stared at the screen for a long time, reading and rereading the serial numbers. One matched the radio clipped to my belt. The other was identical down to the last digit, listed as use at the fire lookout tower. I did not request clarification from dispatch. I did not file a discrepancy report. I knew better now. Anything I tried to formalize would simply be absorbed, corrected, or removed. At 7:12 a.m., a maintenance request appeared in the system, automatically assigned to me. The description was brief: tower access inspection. Recurring. There was no requester name. No creation timestamp. Just an expectation. I closed the task without completing it. The moment I did, the request reappeared, flagged as overdue. I left the station shortly after, telling myself I was conducting a routine perimeter patrol. The words came easily. They always had. As I drove, I noticed small changes that were subtle enough to be dismissed individually, but impossible to ignore together. Trail markers looked newer than they should have been. A fallen tree I remembered. Stepping over last season was upright again. It's cut clean and fresh. A warning sign near a ravine listed hazards that hadn't existed the day before. It wasn't that the park was resetting. It was updating. By mid-morning, visitors began to arrive. Families, couples, solo hikers. I greeted them, answered questions, pointed out safe routes. Everything I said was accurate. Everything I said was also incomplete. I found myself avoiding certain areas in my explanations without consciously deciding to. When someone asked about the old lookout tower, I told them it had been dismantled years ago. The lie came out smoothly. The person nodded and moved on, satisfied. I wondered how many times I had done that before. At 10:03 a.m., a call came in reporting an unattended backpack near a creek-off trail. The description matched one of the items I had seen staged during the night. I acknowledged the call and headed out alone. The bag sat exactly where it had been before, dry despite the damp ground around it. Inside were standard supplies: food, a first aid kit, a folded note. The paper was blank. I turned it over, still blank, but when I held it at an angle to the light, I could see impressions pressed deep into the fibers, as if the words had been written and then removed with force. I left the backpack where it was. Returning to the station just after noon, I found a new entry in the daily log, already written in my handwriting. It documented my response to the call, noting that the area had been cleared and no follow-up was required. The time stamp matched my current time. The entry ended with my initials. I did not remember writing it. When I tried to delete the line, the cursor jumped to the next field, refusing the action. That was when I understood the full scope of my role. I wasn't just observing the system. I was maintaining it. whether I intended to or not. The afternoon passed in fragments. Small tasks completed themselves. Questions answered before they were asked. I felt myself slipping into a rhythm that wasn't exhaustion but something closer to surrender. The park didn't need me to disappear. It needed me to remain functional, present, reliable. Someone who could be trusted not to look too closely at the empty spaces. At 3:29 p.m., I received a visitor complaint about missing trail signage. I followed the coordinates and found the sign leaning against a tree, face down. When I lifted it, I saw names carved into the back, just like the ones at the tower. Fewer this time. Some had been scratched out. Others were deeply etched, as if to make sure they would last. At the bottom, a fresh space waited, unmarked. I replaced the sign and walked away. As evening approached, I felt the weight of a coming night settle in. Not dread exactly. Expectation. The system had allowed me to remember more than I should have. And I sensed that window closing. Already, details from the previous night felt blurred at the edges. The face at the tower. The voices on the radio. They were becoming impressions instead of memories. At 6:58 p.m., the maintenance request appeared again. Tower access inspection. Recurring. I accepted it this time. The system acknowledged the action with a quiet confirmation chime. Relief followed, unearned and immediate. I have not gone back to the tower yet. Not today, but I know I will. The task will remain open until I do. That is how the park ensures continuity. Not through force, but through procedure. Through habits reinforced over years, until compliance feels indistinguishable from professionalism. If you are reading this, understand that what I am recording now is already at risk of being smoothed over, corrected, or quietly removed. The disappearances are not sudden events. They are administrative outcomes. And I am beginning to realize that the most dangerous thing in this forest is not what goes missing, but what stays behind long enough to make it all seem normal. I waited until the last visitor signed out at the trail register before preparing to leave the station again. The sun was already low, dragging long shadows across the clearing, and the forest had begun the quiet transition it always makes at the end of the day. It wasn't silence yet, but a thinning of sound, like a room slowly emptying. I checked my gear without really looking at it. Muscle memory doing the work. Radio, flashlight, map keys, everything in its place. Everything correct. The maintenance task sat open on the screen behind me. Tower access inspection. Recurring. The word no longer bothered me the way it should have. Recurring meant expected. Expected meant manageable. That was how the system trained you, not with fear, but with repetition. I told dispatch I was conducting a late patrol. They acknowledged without comment. No one asked why. No one ever did. The drive toward the tower felt shorter than it should have. I passed familiar landmarks too quickly, as if the distance between them had been compressed. When I slowed down to check my bearings, the GPS recalculated and reassured me I was on schedule. On whose schedule, it didn't say. I parked where the road ended and continued on foot. The path was clearer now, less like an afterthought and more like a maintained trail. Branches had been trimmed back. Stones had been moved aside. Someone had been here recently, and the realization didn't produce alarm so much as resignation. Of course they had. Of course it was ready. Halfway up the incline, I noticed the first light. Not the tower beacon, which hadn't been operational for years, but a soft glow between the trees, low to the ground. It pulsed faintly, steady and patient. I stopped and watched it for a full minute. It didn't approach. It didn't retreat. It simply existed, as if waiting for acknowledgement. I keyed my radio and reported a visual anomaly. Keeping my tone neutral, the transmission went through. Dispatch responded with a generic acknowledgement and asked me to proceed with the inspection. They did not ask for clarification. The light dimmed as I resumed walking, fading until it was no longer visible. At the base of the tower, the air felt different again. Not colder. Denser. Sounds didn't echo properly. My footsteps seemed to land and stop without reverberation, as if the ground were absorbing them. The ladder was still clear. The wood looked reinforced, newer than it should have been. I placed my hand on the first rung and paused, listening. The radio crackled softly, not with static this time, but with a low murmur of voices too faint to distinguish. I didn't ask for identification. I climbed. The platform greeted me with the same impossible familiarity. Desk, chair, logbook, all of it in place. I approached the book slowly and turned to the next blank page. The date was already filled in. Today's date. Below it, a heading I didn't remember writing: continuity check. I sat down and read the previous entries. They described tasks I had completed earlier that afternoon, down to details I hadn't consciously noted. Visitor interactions, signage inspections, inventory reconciliations. Everything accurate. Everything phrased the way I would phrase it. The final line ended with a reminder to return to the station before nightfall. Night had already begun. I heard movement below the platform. Footsteps on gravel. Measured. I stood and looked down through the railing. A figure stood at the base of the tower, facing the ladder. The uniform was correct. The posture was relaxed, almost casual. When it looked up, the face was not mine this time. It belonged to a ranger I recognized from training years ago. Someone who had transferred out, according to official records. Someone whose name I had seen carved into the wood. He raised a hand in greeting. I didn't return it. He spoke calmly, telling me I was doing well, that the adjustments were holding, that the park appreciated consistency. His voice carried easily, unaffected by distance. I asked him where he had been assigned now. He smiled in a way that suggested the question didn't apply anymore. He told me the system worked best when there was overlap. When one ranger eased into the role while another eased out. No gaps. No sudden losses. Just a handoff, smooth enough that no one outside noticed the change. I asked him what happened if someone refused. He looked away toward the trees, considering. Then he said refusals were logged as anomalies. Anomalies required correction. Correction was rarely gentle. The radio on my belt vibrated, a silent alert. An incoming task notification. I didn't need to check it to know what it would be. Station return. Shift transition. Recurring. When I looked back down, the ranger at the base of the tower was gone. The forest had closed in again, swallowing the space where he had stood. Only the ladder remained, waiting. I finished the inspection quickly, marking the task complete in the logbook. The moment I closed it, the murmuring on the radio stopped. The air lightened, just slightly, enough to breathe normally again. The walk back to the truck felt longer than the approach. Darkness settled fully, and with it came the familiar sounds of the forest at night. Crickets. Distant movement. The world resuming its surface, level normalcy. When I reached the road, my headlights illuminated a reflective vest hanging from a tree branch. Standard issue. Clean. Unworn. I left it there. At the station, the lights were on. The door unlocked. Inside, the board displayed a full roster. Active personnel only. No missing cases. No gaps. The maintenance task was marked completed, time-stamped and approved. I sat at the desk and waited for the next check-in. When the radio chimed, I answered automatically. My voice sounded like it always had. Steady, capable, reliable. As I write this, I am aware that my resistance is thinning. Not because I agree with what the park does, but because it has made disagreement inefficient. Everything here rewards compliance with ease and punishes defiance with complexity, confusion, erasure. The disappearances are not enforced by force, but by exhaustion. The day is not over yet. It will not be over until the system decides it is. And I am beginning to understand that as long as I remain on duty, the forest will remain quiet, orderly, and deceptively complete. That is the trade. Night settled fully after my return to the station, not with a sudden drop in light, but with a gradual thickening of darkness, as if the air itself had decided to hold less visibility. The clock read 8:22 p.m. The same day continued to stretch, refusing to conclude. I logged my return, closed out the maintenance task, and waited for the quiet acknowledgement chime. It came immediately. Efficient. Satisfying. Dangerous. I made coffee I didn't need and drank it anyway. The taste grounded me, reminded me that my body was still here, still responding to ordinary things. Outside the windows, the forest reflected back only fragments of the station's interior light, broken by trunks and branches. I avoided looking too long. The reflection made it easier to imagine. There was nothing beyond the glass. At 8:51 p.m., a new incident appeared in the system. Unattended vehicle near the northern access road. No caller ID. No vehicle description. Just coordinates and a suggested response time. I stared at the screen, weighing the effort of refusing against the simplicity of compliance. Compliance won. It usually did. The drive north felt wrong from the start. The road markers appeared out of sequence. Numbers repeating or skipping entirely. My headlights passed the same fallen log twice, identical down to the split in its bark. The GPS recalculated repeatedly, each time insisting I was exactly where I needed to be. When I reached the coordinates, there was no vehicle. Instead, there was a turnout I didn't recognize, cut cleanly into the roadside, gravel freshly laid. Tire tracks led in and stopped. No vehicle. No footprints leading away. Just an empty space prepared for something that had already been removed. I stepped out of the truck and felt that same pressure in the air, the sense of sound being dampened. I reported the scene as clear. The system accepted it without question. As I turned back, my flashlight beam caught on something reflective deeper in the trees. I hesitated, then followed it, telling myself I was just confirming there was no hazard. The object was a ranger badge, pinned carefully to the trunk of a tree at eye level. It bore a name I recognized immediately. A ranger who had mentored me during my first year. According to official records, he had retired early due to injury. I left the badge where it was. The radio crackled softly on the way back. Not enough to form words, but enough to suggest activity. I remembered what the ranger at the tower had said. No gaps. No sudden losses. Just transitions smoothed so thoroughly that no one noticed the before and after. Back at the station, I found that the coffee pot was empty again, though I didn't remember finishing it. The logbook had a new entry, time stamped 9:37 p.m., documenting my response to the Northern Access call. Accurate. Complete. Written in my hand, I added nothing. There was nothing left to add. At 10:14 p.m., a visitor arrived. That alone was unusual. The park gates were closed. Night access required special permits, none of which had been issued. I watched from the window as a lone figure approached on foot, stopping at the edge of the light cast by the station. He stood there patiently, hands visible, posture non-threatening. When he stepped closer, I recognized him with a jolt of delayed memory. He was the hiker from earlier in the day, the one who couldn't remember the person by the creek. I opened the door. He asked if he could come in and warm up. His voice sounded tired, strained, like he'd been speaking for hours without rest. I let him inside and offered him a chair. He thanked me and sat, glancing around the station with a mixture of relief and confusion. He asked me how late the station stayed open. I told him the truth, or something close to it. As long as someone is on duty. He nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he'd already suspected. He told me he'd lost track of time on the trail, that the sun had gone down faster than he expected, that he'd followed what he thought were markers back toward the road, only to end up circling the same clearing over and over. He said he'd started seeing lights between the trees. Low ones. Steady ones. He asked me if that was normal. I told him it wasn't. He leaned forward then, lowering his voice, and asked me why there were names carved into the back of the trail signs. He said he hadn't noticed them at first, but once he did, he couldn't stop seeing them. He said one of the names was his. I felt something tighten behind my eyes, a pressure that threatened to become panic. I asked him for identification. He handed me his driver's license. The name matched the permit he'd signed that morning. A living person. Present. Still accounted for. I checked the system. No missing persons matched him. No alerts. No gaps. Yet, I told him he needed to leave the park immediately. That it wasn't safe to remain after dark. The words came out sharper than I intended. He looked relieved, grateful even, and stood quickly. As I walked him to the door, the radio on the desk chimed with a new notification. Visitor exit log. Timestamped the moment he crossed the threshold. He paused outside and turned back to me, asking one last question. He wanted to know if I would remember him tomorrow. I didn't answer. He left, his footsteps fading into the darkness beyond the station lights. I waited until they were gone, then checked the system again. His permit had been marked completed. Exit confirmed. No further action required. At 11:02 p.m., the missing persons board updated on its own. A single new card appeared briefly, then slid into place as if guided by an unseen hand. The name was the hiker's. Status unresolved. Location administrative review. I removed the card immediately. The board went blank again. The radio emitted a soft, approving chime. I am writing this now with the growing awareness that my actions no longer feel like decisions. They feel like reflexes shaped by an environment that rewards preservation of order above all else. Each time I intervene, each time I quietly remove a name, redirect a visitor, close out a task, the system responds by making the next step easier. The disappearances are accelerating, not in number but in efficiency. Fewer signs, cleaner records, smoother transitions. And I am no longer certain whether my resistance is slowing that process or perfecting it. The day still hasn't ended. I can feel the next overlap approaching. Sometime after 11:30 p.m., the station began to feel too large for just one person. Not physically larger, but stretched in a way that made every sound travel farther than it should have. The tick of the wall clock echoed. The hum of the refrigerator lingered after it shut off. Even my breathing seemed to take longer to settle. I checked the time repeatedly, expecting it to jump forward, to finally release me into a new day. It didn't. The date on every display remained unchanged. I tried to distract myself with routine. I reorganized the supply cabinet, aligning items that were already aligned. I wiped down the desk, careful not to smudge the ink in the logbook. Each small task brought a brief sense of relief, followed by a deeper unease. The more precisely I followed procedure, the more the station seemed to respond, lights steadying, systems smoothing over, like a machine pleased with its operator. At 12:04 a.m., the radio initiated a check-in without prompting. No tone, no call sign. Just my name spoken clearly in a neutral voice. I answered before thinking. The response came back immediately, confirming my status as active and asking me to stand by for overlap confirmation. I asked what that meant. The radio went silent. The motion sensor, near the service road, triggered moments later. I pulled up the camera feed and saw two figures standing just beyond the reach of the station lights. Both wore ranger uniforms. Both stood still, facing the building. Their features were indistinct at that distance, but their posture was unmistakable. Waiting. Not approaching. Not leaving. I stepped outside despite every instinct telling me to stay inside the boundary of the light. The air felt heavy again. That familiar pressure that dulled sound and flattened depth. As I got closer, the figures resolved into two men I recognized. One had trained me. The other I had replaced when he transferred out abruptly years ago. According to the records I remembered, both were alive. Both had moved on. Neither should have been here. They greeted me by name. They spoke calmly, explaining that the overlap window was open longer than usual because the park had experienced increased strain. Visitor numbers, trail erosion, administrative discrepancies. Too many variables, not enough continuity. They told me I had adapted well, faster than most. That I understood the importance of keeping the system clean. I asked them what happened to the hiker. One of them glanced toward the trees, then back at me. He said the hiker had been processed, that his presence had introduced instability, that he would be redirected into a category that no longer required active supervision. I asked what that meant in practical terms. He replied that practical terms were exactly what the park was trying to avoid. They offered me a choice, though it was framed like a courtesy rather than an option. I could continue my role as primary continuity anchor, or I could begin transition out, allowing someone else to step in gradually. I asked what transition out looked like. They didn't answer directly. They said it involved rest, fewer memories, less responsibility. I thought of the names carved into the signs, the badges left behind, the empty spaces smoothed over, so completely that no one outside noticed. I realized then that transition out wasn't an exit. It was a reassignment to absence. I told them I needed time to consider. They accepted that without protest. One of them reminded me that time was flexible here, but not infinite. Then both turned and walked into the forest, disappearing not suddenly, but naturally, as if the darkness had simply closed around them. Back inside, I found the logbook open to a new page. The heading read Overlap Assessment. Beneath it, my name was already written, followed by a checklist. Items like responsiveness, compliance, memory retention, emotional interference. Several boxes were already marked. The last line read Decision Pending. I closed the book and pushed it away. At 1:17 a.m., A distress call came from deep within the park. A weak signal, breaking in and out, but clearly human. A woman's voice, panicked, asking for help and repeating that she couldn't find the trail anymore. The coordinates bounced erratically, never settling. Dispatch did not acknowledge the call. The system did not generate an incident ticket. I answered anyway. Her relief was immediate, overwhelming. She said she'd been hiking since morning and everything had gone wrong after sunset. That her phone battery was nearly dead. That she kept seeing lights that led nowhere. I told her to stay where she was, to keep talking. I grabbed my jacket and keys. Before I reached the door, the radio cut off. The station lights flickered once, then stabilized. A notification appeared on the screen. Distress signal resolved. Source environmental interference. No action required. I stood there. Hand on the door handle, feeling something tear loose inside me. Anger, finally sharp enough to override the numbness. I reopened the incident system and tried to manually create a report. The cursor blinked, then the entire interface reset. When it came back up, the screen displayed a single message. Continuity preserved. I didn't leave the station. I sat on the floor instead, back against the wall. Radio clenched in my hand like it might still be useful as a lifeline rather than a leash. I don't know how long I stayed there. Long enough for the anger to burn itself, down into something colder and more focused. The realization came quietly. The park didn't just erase people. It replaced their impact with structure. Lights that led nowhere. Voices that never reached dispatch. Systems that intercepted distress before it could become disorder. And rangers like me, positioned just close enough to humanity to intervene without ever truly helping. At 2:58 a.m., the overlap notification returned. Decision required. I haven't responded yet, but I can feel the pressure building again. The expectation tightening like a schedule that refuses to be missed. I know that if I choose to remain, more calls like that, women's will come through me and die with me. And if I choose to transition out, someone else will take my place. Just as unprepared, just as slowly reshaped. There is no choice here that doesn't serve the system. The only difference is whether I am aware of it. I didn't answer the overlap notification. I let it sit on the screen, blinking patiently, as if patience itself were a resource the port afford to waste. The time read 3:06 a.m., still the same day. My body felt heavy, in a way that sleep could not fix, a weight that settled behind my eyes and along my spine, urging me towards stillness rather than rest. I stood and moved through the station slowly, deliberately, touching familiar surfaces as if to anchor myself. The desk, the doorframe, the radio rack. Everything was exactly where it belonged. Too exactly. The park had always been meticulous, but now I could sense the intention behind it. The way order here was not a preference, but a defense mechanism. I opened the equipment locker and found a second jacket hanging beside mine. Same size. Same wear pattern. The name tag read Harper. I closed the locker without removing it. The radio crackled softly, then spoke again. Not with a voice this time, but with text scrolling across the small display. Overlap window nearing closure. Please confirm status. I turned the radio off. The scrolling continued for 3 more seconds before stopping, as if the device needed time to accept my refusal. At 3:24 a.m., the exterior cameras switched feeds on their own. The main monitor now showed the service road leading away from the station. In the center of the image stood a single figure facing the camera. Not moving. Not signaling. just present. I zoomed in until the pixels began to break apart. It was me. Not an exact reflection, not a trick of lighting. The uniform was older, slightly more worn, the posture more rigid, the face calmer than I felt, eyes fixed on the building with a focus that suggested familiarity, ownership even. The timestamp on the feed labeled him as unit active. I stepped outside. The night air pressed in immediately, thick and damp, carrying the faint smell of pine and soil. The figure didn't move as I approached. When I stopped a few feet away, I realized something unsettling. He wasn't breathing. At least, not in the way a living person does. His chest didn't rise or fall. He simply stood there, sustained by something else. He spoke first, telling me I was late. The words echoed something deep and rehearsed inside my own mind. He said the window was closing, that too much deviation created friction. Friction created noise. Noise attracted attention. The park could tolerate many things, but attention was not one of them. I asked him if he remembered the woman on the radio. His expression didn't change. He said, she had been contained within acceptable loss parameters. He said, my reaction to her call had been noted and flagged as emotional interference. He said that was why overlap was required sooner than anticipated. I felt a surge of anger again, sharper than before. I told him that what the park was doing wasn't maintenance. It was disappearance dressed up as procedure. I told him that people trusted rangers to find them, not file them away. He listened patiently, the way you listen to a weather report. Then he said trust was precisely the problem. Trust created expectation. Expectation created instability when outcomes couldn't be guaranteed. The park's solution was not to eliminate people, but to eliminate unresolved narratives. I asked him what would happen to me if I refused again. He tilted his head slightly, considering. Then he said refusal didn't result in punishment. It resulted in reassignment. I asked where. He gestured toward the forest, vague and encompassing. Somewhere that did not require reports. Somewhere without logs or boards or names carved into wood. I stepped back, heart pounding. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. The overlap wasn't a chase. It was a convergence. Behind us, the station door opened. Another ranger stood in the doorway, younger, unfamiliar. His uniform was new. His face carried the nervous alertness of someone still learning the boundaries of their role. He looked from me to the figure on the road, confusion tightening his features. I realized then that this was how it always happened. Not one replacement, but layers. Continuity ensured through redundancy. The younger ranger asked if everything was all right. The figure answered for me, saying the transition was in progress and supervision was required. The younger ranger nodded, relief flooding his expression at having clear instructions. I saw myself in him, years ago. Eager, trusting, unaware of how narrow the definition of safety really was here. I made my decision then, not because it was right, but because delay would only tighten the system's grip. I told the younger ranger to stay inside and wait for further instructions. I told the figure on the road that I would handle the final checks alone. For the first time, his expression shifted. Not surprise. Recognition. I walked past him toward the forest, following the service road until the station lights fell away behind me. The trees closed in quickly, the path narrowing until it felt more like a suggestion than a route. My radio vibrated once, then went still. No more messages. No more prompts. The system, it seemed, was allowing this. The forest felt different without the constant pull of procedure. Still dangerous. Still vast. But quieter in a way that felt earned rather than enforced. I walked until my legs burned and my thoughts slowed. Until the sense of being watched thinned into something more distant. At some point I reached a clearing I didn't recognize. No trail markers. No signs. Just trees and earth and sky. I sat down and waited, not for rescue, not for resolution, but for the day to finally end. I don't know how long I stayed there. Long enough for the sky to begin to lighten at the edges. Long enough to feel the weight of the park shift us. We're settling onto someone new. When the sun finally rose, the date on my watch changed for the first time since all this began. I stood and turned back toward the forest, unsure if the station still existed in any way that mattered to me. If this record survives, understand this. The system does not need cruelty to function. It only needs people willing to confuse order with safety and silence with peace. I stepped out of that equation as quietly as I could. I don't know who is on duty now, but I know the forest is still being watched. The forest at dawn does not announce itself. Light arrives gradually, seeping into low places first, thinning the darkness rather than defeating it. I stood in the clearing watching that happen, aware that for the first time, in what felt like an entire lifetime, the day was moving forward instead of looping back on itself. The date on my watch held steady. The hours advanced normally. No alerts. No tones. No quiet pressure urging me to respond. I walked for a long time before I saw anything that resembled a trail. When I did, it wasn't marked. Just a subtle break in the undergrowth where enough feet had passed to leave a memory in the soil. I followed it without confidence or urgency, letting my body decide the pace. Hunger eventually made itself known. So did fatigue. Ordinary sensations returned one by one, tentative at first, then undeniable. By mid-morning I reached the edge of the park. There was no sign, no gate. Just a stretch of road that looked too clean, too recent, like it had been maintained carefully for reasons no one questioned. A truck passed while I stood there, slowing slightly before continuing on. The driver didn't look at me. Or maybe he did, and I was already becoming someone unremarkable. I did not go back to the station. I stayed in a small town outside the boundary for several days, long enough for the tension in my body to loosen, long enough for sleep to come without interruption. I avoided mirrors at first, half expecting to see someone else looking back. When I finally did look, I saw myself. Taffiner, still present. I tried to call the park on the third day. The number rang and connected, and a familiar automated greeting played. I waited for a human voice. None came. When I checked the call log afterward, the outgoing call wasn't there. I didn't try again. I searched online instead. Official park reports, press releases, staffing updates. Everything was clean. No mention of unusual incidents. No missing rangers. The current roster listed a different name under my former position. Someone younger. Someone with a clean record and a photograph that showed the kind of confidence that comes from believing the system exists to protect you. There was a brief article posted by a local paper about a hiker who failed to check out at a trailhead the previous week. It was phrased carefully. Delayed return. Search inconclusive. No indication of wrongdoing. Comments were disabled. I closed the browser. I am writing this now from a place far enough away that the forest no longer fills my peripheral vision. Even so, I can feel it sometimes, a low awareness like a pressure change before weather shifts. I know the park is still functioning, It always will. The system doesn't collapse when someone leaves. It compensates. What I understand now, with a clarity that took too long to arrive, is that the disappearances were never the goal. They were a byproduct. What the park truly protects is continuity without accountability. A version of order that removes unresolved stories instead of resolving them. A silence maintained not by force, but by procedure, habit, and the quiet cooperation of people who believe are keeping others safe. I don't know what happens to those who are reassigned fully. Those who fade into the categories without names. I don't know if they are still alive in any way that matters. I only know that stepping outside the system doesn't undo it. It just shifts its focus. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear a radio tone in the distance. Not close enough to understand, not urgent enough to answer. I don't respond. I let it pass. If you ever find yourself in a park where the records are flawless, where nothing ever seems to go wrong for long, where missing cases are resolved with unsettling efficiency, pay attention to what isn't being said. Pay attention to how quickly quiet returns after something should have caused noise. And if a ranger tells you a trail no longer exists, even though you're standing on it, believe them. They may be trying to keep you from becoming part of the system that never forgets how to erase.